Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be learning all with you as part of the Drisha's Falls month. Today's class is Mishnah in Depth, Masechet Yevamot. This class is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in the memory of Rifka Rosenwein by her family. This class is designed to accompany an independent daily study of the Mishnah following Mishnah Yomit schedule. We will meet weekly as a community of learners to augment our independent study, enhance our understanding of the mishnayot learned, and support each other as a community of learners in daily study of this foundational text. We have the pleasure of learning today with Rabbi David Silber, who is the Dean of Drisha. Just a note of housekeeping, I will be sending invitations to panelists in Zoom. This will give you the option to unmute yourself, ask questions directly, but if you are not interested in that, that's fine. You are so welcome to ask questions in chat, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook Live. Or you can use the raise your hand feature or message me and I can unmute you. If you have your own copy of Mishnayot, please follow along in Yevamot, but I will also be sharing sources on screen from Sfaria. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi David Silber.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we are proceeding through, again, picking out certain mishnayot. Some people are learning the mishnayot on their own. The way this particular tractate works is the first 5 chapters have some of these cases, and some of them are a bit complicated. And then the tractate will move into other topics, which on the surface don't seem that connected to Yevamot, but I think they are all connected in a certain way. And I hope to touch upon some of the connections that we have. We've already seen, I'm sure, if you're learning the Mishnah, that the order of the mishnayot is always a puzzler. And Tractate Yevamot in general is a big puzzle. Maybe at some point in the future, when we get further into it, we'll sort of look at the whole tractate and try to figure out exactly what the order of Rabbi, who is credited with the redaction of the mishnayot, had in mind. So again, I'm going to pick out a few mishnayot that I think the Mishnah Yomit is up to about the 7th chapter now. So I'll pick out some mishnayot from chapters 4, 5, and 6. I wanted just to touch base as we begin on a Mishnah that appears in the 4th chapter. That's chapter 4, Mishnah number 10. Just because it's a very interesting issue. It was raised very briefly last time we came together to look at Yevamot. So this is chapter 4, Mishnah number 10. So the Mishnah says in Mishnah number 10, Hayivama lo tachlotz v'lo tityabeim ad sheyesh lo shlosha chodashim. This is actually a very interesting halacha, and nowadays it raises all kinds of questions. But let's take the standard case. Married couple, the husband dies, no children. So then, and there's a brother. There has to be a brother. If there's a brother, then the brother has they have two options. They can either agree to do yibum, so they're living together, or if either party doesn't want to do that, then in order to remove what's called zika, which is a central concept, because there's a marriage state that already exists. We call that zika. In order to remove that, the only way to remove it is through what the Torah described as a ceremony called chalitza. In other words, what does not work, and this is interesting, what does not work is simply a get. Normally, to terminate a marriage, in the Mishnah has two options. Either death of either party terminates the marriage, or if the man gives his wife a get, then the marriage is terminated. In the case of Yibum, that is to say, when the husband dies and there's a brother, no children, so there is some kind of state that exists presently between the two, between the widow and the brother. And that is a quasi-state of marriage. She's not permitted to marry anybody else. On the other hand, the get the get doesn't work. I just wanted to make a point about get not working. The get does not work. We're talking in terms of the Mishnah and the Gemara, of course, distinguishes between what what they call Doraita. What is the Torah law? And then the rabbinic tradition can add all kinds of restrictions to put a fence around the Torah or whatever it is. So the get seems to have no place whatsoever when it comes to Yibum, except in the case where they actually is Yibum, then they're married. In that married state, in order to terminate that, you would need a get or death of either party. But prior to actually deciding to live together, Yibum, if the man gave the woman a get, that doesn't work. The only way she can then remarry or marry somebody else if there's chalitza. I mention that because in the 5th chapter, with the Mishnah Yomit, very cryptic, extremely cryptic, the Mishnah talks about giving a get. Now, I'll come back to that, but the giving of a get is a rabbinic issue. If the man would give the woman a get in the state where she is still waiting for the yibum or chalitza, that can disqualify the opportunity of doing yibum. But in order to free her up to remarry, she requires chalitza. That's a very important point. And anyway, the Mishnah here, Mishnah number 10, says that a new restriction we didn't know of. It's mentioned for the first time in chapter 4, Mishnah number 10, and that is when the man dies, the woman can do neither chalitza nor yibum for 3 months. And then the Mishnah added something else. V'chein kol sha'ar hanashim lo yitarsu v'lo yinasu ad shiyu lahen shlosha chadashim echad betulot v'echad beulot echad grushot v'echad almanot echad nusulot v'echad arusot. So the Mishnah has an interesting rule that the Yevamot can do neither yibum or chalitza for 3 months, and not only the Yevamot, but let's say any woman whose husband has died, according to the first opinion of the Mishnah, cannot have erusin or nesuin for 3 months, whether or not she actually was living together with the former husband. Now, I just want to give a general point over here. First of all, that in marriage in general, yibum is an exceptional case in marriage. But normally what happens is, according to the mishnayot elsewhere, not here, the way marriage works is there are 2 stages to marriage. There's what's called erusin, also called kiddushin, and there's nesuin. Those are 2 stages in marriage. And that's the Mishnah in mishnayot in Masechet Kiddushin, where one might have thought this Seder Nashim would have begun. Kiddushin actually is the last tractate of Seder Nashim, strangely enough. But the point is, there's Kiddushin, or erusin, another word, and there's nesuin. Kiddushin means they're actually married, but they're not living together. But they actually are married. In other words, she's considered a married woman. He's married to her. But in the old days, the Mishnah talks about waiting a year till they actually start living together. And during that year, there's all kinds of preparations are made for the marriage. There's a lot of financial arrangements that are made for the marriage, etc. Because it's also a financial arrangement. We'll come to that later in the mishnayot and Yevamot as well. The main place where you have it is Masechet Ketuvot. The Ketuva is essentially a set of obligations, reciprocal obligations, mostly the man towards the woman, but all kinds of mutual obligations. So in the old days, there would be Kiddushin, which is accomplished in one of 3 ways. They can simply sleep together, or he can give her money for the purpose of Kiddushin, or he can write a marriage contract. That's not a Ketuva. He writes a contract, you are married to me. And that creates Kiddushin. The Gemara in the second Kiddushin said that Rav said that nobody should get married, a couple shouldn't get married by simply sleeping together. They always should first be either kesef or shtar. So the common practice is kesef, and if you go to a wedding, so first there's Kiddushin, and they are married, and nowadays the nesuin follows the Kiddushin right away. So chuppah or something else, some kind of symbolic act of them being together. Either the chuppah is that way, or maybe they go to a private room afterwards, or whatever. So that creates what's called nisuin. Our Mishnah says that, first of all, the Yevamot, or any woman whose husband has died, should not remarry for 3 months. And not only not remarry for 3 months, she shouldn't even have kedushin. In other words, not only living with somebody else, but even kedushin or erusin, she should also not do. Now, the reason for that, the Gemara explains, is because if she would remarry in 3 months, or within 3 months, and get pregnant, then the Gemara's concern is you don't know who the father of the child is. That's concern of the Mishnah. In the case of Yibum, it is particularly problematic for the simple reason that if in fact the woman were pregnant, this comes up in the later mishnayot, if in fact the woman were pregnant at the time the husband dies, they have no children, but she's pregnant, and then she gives birth to a healthy child, a viable child, it will turn out retroactively that there should not have been yibum. That's a very important, that will come up in the Mishnah later. Maybe next week we'll talk about that. That's a very important point. And it's not, I would say, obvious. Because you could say, look, at the time, right now, they have no children. She died. Okay, she's pregnant. But whatever. Or she might be pregnant, or she was pregnant in retrospect. But at the time of his death, there was no child. But the Mishnah understands it differently. Mishnah understands that even a potential child would, in fact, if she gives birth to a child, and we know it was the child of the previous husband, then there shouldn't be no yibum. Well, if there should be no yibum and there was yibum, remember at all times that this is a forbidden relationship and a serious one. You're not permitted to marry, a man can't marry his brother's wife. She's forbidden to him, he's forbidden to her. It's one of the arayot. So therefore, it says the Mishnah, you have to wait 3 months. But the Tanna Kama of the Mishnah says something else. You wait 3 months, says the Tanna Kama, even if we know they never actually lived together in the first place. So the previous husband had kedushin. In those days, they waited a year. Okay, there's kedushin, but they never actually lived together. So there really is no chance that the father of this, and then a baby would be born 7 months later, let's say, premature baby. So you don't know which one. If it's 9 months later, you know it's the second guy. Let's say it's a premature birth, say 7 months. Maybe it's 9 months to the first guy or 7 to the second. So you don't know. So the point is, but according to the Tanna Kama in this Mishnah, that doesn't matter. Once they made a rule that after 3 months, for 3 months she should not remarry, that rule applies even in cases where the reason for it doesn't apply. For example, in the case of erusin, that's according to the first view in the Mishnah. There are other views in the Mishnah that say that's not the case, that you can do it. And not only that, by the way, the Mishnah also does not permit this woman to have kedushin. In other words, if she simply has kedushin, then there wouldn't be a problem either, because she's not living with the second guy. So we have here a rule. This is interesting. It comes up a lot. This is an important idea. You have a rabbinic rule that's set up. And then the question is, to what extent the rabbinic rule, which has a reason for it and a good reason, to what extent that rule is now a rule and applies to other situations, even where the rule makes no sense. That is to say, it makes no sense if she were only an arusa and not a nesua. And it also makes no sense if she's only has erusin to the next guy and not nesuin. So the question in the Mishnah is, what cases are covered? The idea that it applies across the board in the terminology of the Gemara and the commentaries on the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch and the works is called a lo plug. Lo plug, we don't distinguish. Okay, that's an important idea. Let me just say, before we finish the Mishnah, and then I'll take comments or questions, let me just say that this is actually a very interesting question nowadays, because nowadays we have tests to determine whether the woman is pregnant or not. So you have to consider, there's no question is the father the first guy or the second guy, you can do all kinds of tests and you can discover very quickly whether the woman was in fact pregnant at the time of the death of the husband. So the question nowadays is, does this rule apply even in situations where the reason for the Mishnah makes no sense, because the Mishnah is concerned about knowing who the father is. In the case of Yibum, it's very important, because if in fact the first guy is the father, then there shouldn't be Yibum in the first place. But even in other cases, we want to know who in fact the father is. It may have all kinds of other implications. So nowadays we can know. And the question is, does the rule still apply nowadays, even where the logic of it does not apply? Let me just finish this Mishnah and then I'll take comments and questions. The idea of waiting 3 months, by the way, the term that's used for waiting 3 months is called havchana. Hey, bet, chet, nun, hey, havchin, to distinguish, like a bechina, a test. A havchana means a way to figure out who the father is. So that's called havchana. So anyway, the Mishnah, according to the first view in the Mishnah, that's called the Tanakama, the unnamed first opinion, which often is followed, says it doesn't make it. It's an across-the-board rule over here. It doesn't make a difference. Woman was only Erison, had Nesuin, makes no difference. It's all the same. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, Hanesuot yitarsu, v'harusot yinasu. He says a married woman can have Erison, kedushin, but we're not living together. So what's the problem? And conversely, the woman who was only had kedushin or Erison can now marry somebody else, because we know the first guy's not the father. They never were together. So therefore, it says chutz min ha'arusot she'Yehuda. It's interesting. The Mishnah, except for the women who have kedushin in Yehuda, the land of Israel in the Mishnah is divided into 3 sections. One section is called Yehuda. There's the north, the middle, and the south. So in Yehuda, apparently, in Yehuda, apparently, it was common that the woman, even though they had no Nesu, and they would be together beforehand. So there we have to be concerned in Yehuda. This appears elsewhere in the Talmud as well about Yehuda. You know, he's used to whatever means that maybe they slept together, maybe he's the father. But outside of that, what's the reason? The reason, the sense of it doesn't work. So therefore, it doesn't apply. That's your Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi has another opinion in the Mishnah. He says, Kol hanoshim yitarsu. All women are permitted to have kedushin right away. Doesn't have to wait 3 months. And then he adds something else in the Mishnah, out of left field. Chutz min ha'almana mipnei ha'ibul. Except for the widow, because of ibul, because of avelut, because of the mourning period. In other words, the view of Rabbi Yossi, it's interesting question actually. We're not talking about Nesuin here. We're talking about Erison. So what is the rule actually? Is the woman permitted to have Erison during, let's say, the first 30 days of after the death of her spouse? So a spouse, there is avelut for a spouse. There's avelut for the 7 relatives. One of them is a spouse, a husband or a wife. So there is a mourning period. The mourning period is 30 days. It's not the mourning period of 12 months is only for parents. That's the most severe. Everybody else, it's a shorter period of 30 days. Rabbi Yossi assumes that in this case, it's the woman whose husband has died. She is not permitted to marry, even to have Erison, not married, to have kedushin, because of ibul. Is that really the rule? I mean, because actually, it's not clear that we follow that rule. In other words, and there are good reasons sometimes not to follow the rule. We're not talking about actually getting married in the sense of living together, but just to have kedushin. So that's the question. Actually, is this the case? Can there be kedushin without actually living together? And there are a lot of different situations where sometimes you might want to do that. the little children involved, all kinds of other complications. In any event, coming back to our Mishnah, so the Mishnah is talking about the rule of what's called havchana. And according to the first view, it applies across the board. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, etc. And Rabbi Yossi has another opinion. Generally speaking, we follow the first opinion, the Tanakh. Of course, nowadays we actually can know way before 3 months. And when one studies this and one studies the halacha of it, so you come across a lot of interesting questions. The study of halacha, the most interesting thing is to read various shailot and shuvot that deal with real life situations, because there you have to work out all these different rules in light of all kinds of unusual or sometimes difficult situations. Okay, let me just stop at this point. Obviously, the rule comes up in Yevamot because in Yevamot there's a real problem, because if in fact it's the first father is the first guy, then there shouldn't be Yibum at all. But once you have that, you see how the Mishnah in Yevamot, suddenly other things get involved. This very Mishnah, you have all marriages, and you have Avelut on top of it. You put into the Mishnah 10 of chapter 4. Okay, let me just stop here for a moment. If there are any questions or comments, I'll take them.
Yes, this came in on chat from Rachel Burke. She asked, this concept about Yehuda is so interesting. Was it an area minchag or a lack of adherence to halacha?
Very good question. I don't know, but it's found in several places, actually. What it sounds like to me, it sounds more like Rebo Gospel. It sounds like that in Yehuda, they were much less stringent about keeping the couple apart. That's what it sounds like to me. Doesn't necessarily mean that the Mishnah condones this behavior. But what it sounds like is that the way they would, for whatever reason, I don't know why, sometimes as a presumption I'd be is that there was Kedushin. The woman would live with the family, with her family. The groom lives with his family, or maybe he's separate, I'm not sure, but they're not really in any kind of proximity during this time. Apparently in Yehuda, for whatever reasons, maybe sociological, the answer is I don't know why. But what it sounds like is that they actually are in close proximity. Maybe she moved into his parents' house beforehand, and then they're in close proximity. Things could happen. They're already actually technically married, so we can understand things could take place if they're actually married to each other. But I don't know whether it's. I don't think the Mishnah necessarily approves of this, but it's simply concerned about it. It's a concern, and the reason given is because they're sort of used to each other. That it's an expression that appears in many places. Libo Gaspa. They're used to each other, so that's used to being around. Sounds like they're actually occupying the same space in some sense. But again, I don't know why would it be Dafka and Yehuda that they're sort of moving in or going to be across the street or whatever it is.
And just to follow up from Rachel in chat, so this whole behavior was mentioned in a negative light?
Well, it's mentioned. I'm not sure. Is it negative? It's more. I'm not saying. What I'm saying is, it's mentioned as a fact of life. Is how it's mentioned. I don't think it doesn't. I'm saying the Mishnah doesn't necessarily approve. It's simply saying that we have to. The concern over here in Masechet Yevamot is a real concern, because if in fact she was already pregnant, then there is no yibum. That fact itself, which we'll encounter later, as I said in the beginning, is not something that's obviously true. One could easily have said, pregnant or not, at the time of his death, there were no children. So the brother should marry. But the Mishnah understands it differently, since the purpose of it is that there should be a child that sort of bears the name of the brother. In this case, there will be. Just wait a few months. There will be one, which would obviate the need for yibum. And once you obviate the need for yibum, it's actually forbidden, because it's one of the arayot. So that's the concern. But I don't think that, I wouldn't read approval into the Mishnah, or actually disapproval. The Mishnah is saying a fact over here, that in Yehuda, we have to be concerned about this problem, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. His name is Rabbi Yehuda, and he talked about Yehuda, but I think it's just a coincidence. But anyway, according to Rabbi Yehuda, He says, listen, in Yehuda, even in the Arusa, because yes, they weren't living together technically, but they might have been together. Anybody else?
What is the halacha? Since
The
today you
halacha
have
is,
pregnancy tests.
but the halacha on the book, it depends who you ask. The halacha, the default is you wait 3 months. That's the default. When the questions come up are, and that's the interesting thing about studying, people study halacha. And to me, I never taught halacha. I never got involved in it. I'm actually becoming very interested in it. But what's interesting about, if you want to study halacha, I think, the place to go outside of read the sources and the Gemara and everything, but the place to go is in the Shelot and the Shuvot. The responds are the place to go, because the responds are always deal with difficult questions. They don't deal with the normal cases. They deal with all kinds of other unusual cases, and usually they're very interesting because often you have 4 or 5 conflicting principles of the halacha which come together, and the one responding is going to give their opinion about what predominates in this case. I mean, there is a world of Shelot and Shuvot, hundreds of thousands of them, and it's true that certain people that do have a certain orientation. Again, so for example, when it comes to things like aguna, which comes up towards the end of this tractate, you can see all of the great responders are concerned about aguna. Some of them they're all concerned, but some of them are willing to find all kinds of ways to permit the woman to remarry, even though on the face of it, you say to yourself, that sounds pretty far out. Now, they're picking up on the tradition of the Mishnah, which already is going out of its way to find a way. So again, but they have to still deal with the cases. And, there are all kinds of difficult cases. It's the odd cases which are most interesting, which involve people's personal situations, all kinds of other sort of factors which come up in terms of, simply people's, sometimes it's just people living in dire consequences. We want to try to help everybody out. That's, the responders typically are going out of their way to do what's right. On the other hand, they have a set of rules they're dealing with. They can't just make them up. So the question is how they deal with it. And, any given topic, you could have maybe 100 different 100 different Shelot and Shuvot, and you can find all kinds of interesting, and some often disagreements. So to me, that's where, if I were teaching halacha, I would focus on after you get to the basic sources, I would focus on the Shelot and the Shuvot. But the default today is actually to wait, even though we know very well. I have another theory about it. I just want to make another point about this, which is, I wonder, because you see in this Mishnah, at the end of the Mishnah, it throws in out of left field the view of Rabbi Yossi that the almana should wait because she's in Avelut. And what I wonder is actually, I wonder whether that's actually a factor altogether here. But it's not just the question of knowing which, who the father is. I'm wondering whether from a psychological point of view, the Mishnah is suggesting that it's good to wait in general. Rabbi Yossi puts it in terms of Avelut, but more than that, if you're married for quite a while, there's all kinds of stuff, those kinds of emotional connections and stuff like that. So to jump into a new relationship couldn't be problematic. And therefore, for any hundreds of reasons, so maybe the halacha of Havchana is not only about determining the parenthood, maybe it's also a way to say, wait. By the way, even Rabbi Yossi always says you can have kedushin. He doesn't say they're living together. He says you can have kedushin, and there can be good reasons why. Sometimes, let's say situations where the wife dies, and the husband and they have a bunch of little kids. The presumption is that the father is not going to do a great job of caring for the kids. There is a situation in the Gemara, certainly. I don't think it's in the Mishnah. I forget his name, who at the funeral gave somebody kesef kedushin at his wife's funeral. So the point is, he said that's crazy. On the other hand, he's got 6 little kids. He needs to, and very often it's just to take care of the kids. I mean, it's not something you dislike, but there is that factor. Someone's got to care for these little children. And the presumption is that the men often were not well equipped to do that. So there are a lot of factors here, but the default would be waiting. Okay, let's.
Excuse me,
yes.
Rabbi Silber.
when you
Yes.
said about the waiting and that going from one to the other, reminded me there's a Rashi on in Devarim, v'halcha v'hayta le'ish acher, with the Gerushin, that she can't
Yes.
leave his house and go there. That would also require or advocate for a waiting period, a separation before she marries somebody else. That was the Rashi there.
You have to look at the Rashi. I know what you're referring to. Yeah. No, I think in general, I think that's the Mishnah is a legal document for the most part. I mean, there are other things there occasionally, but the legal document never can capture fully the real life situation. And those responding who write the Tshuvot basically are taking into account. I mean, the great ones always take into account the personal situation of the people involved in the case. Which is why I think the Shelot and Tshuvot are the most interesting, because they're trying to take everything into account. They're dealing with the law, but they're also trying to understand how the law can speak to real life situations. So
the application of it.
The application it's the most interesting, actually. And it's actually a world. There's a world. Okay, somebody else had a question?
Rabbi Silber, yeah. I don't know
Yes.
if this was addressed already and I just missed it, but I just went back to the original Psukim in Devarim. And to me, the slant seems to be very heavily towards a son, if there is no son. But the Mishnah doesn't bring that up at all. So we just assume that.
No, the Mishnah does.
Mishnah
There is a Mishnah. No. There is a Mishnah that talks about when it says Bain, it says it can be a boy or a girl, actually. The Mishnah does address exactly that. You have to remember, the Torah is written generally in the language of the men. But the Mishnah, I searched for it. It's a Mishnah. We haven't done every Mishnah. But the Mishnah talks about, there are mishnayot that talk about the brother and talk about the child. The mishnayot refer to that. And the Mishnah says that Mishnah talks about a child. And Mishnah says, first of all, it could be any child. It can be a child, a boy or a girl. It can also be a child who was actually born out of a forbidden relationship. Let's say the man is married to a woman that he's forbidden to marry. But someone somebody that they actually are married. Just to refresh our memory, this actually is the Mishnah later on in the last Mishnah in the 4th chapter, talks about a mamzer. Who was a mamzer? So the point is, Rabbi Akiva thinks any forbidden relationship creates a mamzer, and so according to Rabbi Akiva, let's say if a man married let's say a Kohen marries possibly a Kohen marries a divorcee. According to Rabbi Akiva, we don't follow this view. Possibly that could be a mamzer, but that child is actually considered the child of this couple. So then there would not be yibum in such a case, even though it's a forbidden relationship, and the child, according to Rabbi Akiva, is even a mamzer, or even according to others, not a mamzer, but forbidden. But it doesn't make a difference. That child is still a child. So the Mishnah deals with that. And it deals with the question of a brother, the same kind of thing. And the Mishnah has very wide definitions of brother and also of child. But the Mishnah does deal with this. So it does say Bain in the Torah, you're right. But it's understood in this case to be any child. Because any child, because the idea of Yibum is to build up the house of the deceased brother. So to have some kind of heir who continues the brother's line. So a boy or a girl makes no difference, says the Mishnah. Either way. If I find the Mishnah, I'll tell you where it is. But the Mishnah does deal with this question actually: who was a child and who was a brother? So that's the way these texts work. Okay, let's continue now. Okay, let me just make one comment about chapter 5. Chapter 5 has 6 mishnayot. I'm not going to get into much chapter 5, but I want to make one point about chapter 5. It's one of these mishnayot. It's one of the chapters. It's a short chapter. And it's very, very cryptic. I'll just read the first Mishnah. You get a sense of how cryptic it is. You probably read it already. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, it's chapter 5. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, ein get achar get, v'lo ma'amar achar ma'amar, v'lo bila achar bila, v'lo chalitza achar chalitza. The Chachamim omrim yesh get achar get, v'yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar, v'lo achar bila, v'lo achar chalitza klum. So that's the Mishnah. Now, when you read this Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel said there's no bill of divorce after a bill of divorce. There's no ma'amar after ma'amar. There's no bilas, sex after sex, and there's no chalitza after chalitza. Chachamim disagree with the first two. There is get and there is ma'amar, but not after be'ilah, not after chalitza. Now, the mishnayot and the rest of this chapter actually give the cases of what this Mishnah is referring to. You read this Mishnah, and you have actually no idea what the Mishnah is talking about. It's so cryptic, but the other mishnayot in chapter 5 talk about, explain what the Mishnah is saying. So let me just make a general observation about chapter 5 in Masechet Yevamot, and then we'll move to chapter 6. The point is this, let's just to get it straight. With Yibum, so Yibum, Reuven's married to Leah, Reuven dies. Shimon is the brother, no children. Shimon has two options. Shimon and Leah have two options. One is they can get married. It's called Yibum. Means they sleep together. Or the other option is one of them doesn't want. So then to eliminate that, there's chalitza. Get does not work. Get doesn't work. Fine. But, and this is what the Mishnah this is what the Mishnayot talk about in chapter 5, even though get doesn't work, to eliminate the relationship between Leah and Shimon being the brother, Leah being the widow, but get does work to eliminate the possibility of having Yibum. Because if in fact Shimon gives Leah a get, which he shouldn't do, but he gave her a get, the idea of the get was to terminate, to eliminate the relationship that already exists between them, called Zika. Once that happens, even if they sleep together afterwards, the rabbis determined that is an illegitimate bia, and then you would still require chalitza. So the get doesn't work to terminate the relationship, but it works to invalidate the bia, and you still need chalitza. You always need chalitza to terminate. That's the first point. The second point, and I mentioned this last week, is this idea of ma'amar. So what ma'amar is, again, from the Torah standpoint, the Mishnah thinks there's only one way for them to be married, which is bila, living together. But the rabbis didn't like this idea of simply the couple just starting to live together, sleeping together. So they said that before the couple gets married or is together, there should be ma'amar. Ma'amar is essentially a kind of kedushin. So the man would give the woman money or write a bill of kedushin, a shtar, and then you have the bia. So ma'amar, and then bia is the way it's supposed to be. Just as in the Tractate Kedushin, the Mishnah says there's three ways to have kedushin, but the Gemara says the only way that's appropriate would be for have what we call kedushin, either kedushin kesef, aret mekudeshes, whatever, or shtar. Okay, so but mamar does accomplish something. According to Beit Shammai, it actually creates kedushin, but according to Beit Hillel and the consensus of the Mishnah, it doesn't create kedushin. But what it does do is that let's say you have a case where, let's say there are two brothers. So there's Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven dies. There's Leah as the wife. Two brothers. If in fact Shimon gives kedushay kesef mamar, he says mamar is preliminary to yibum, then the other brother would be out of the picture. And then the question is, if there's mamar, let's say the case where you have mamar. So since mamar is a kind of kedushin, okay, then if he doesn't want to go forward with this, or they don't want to go forward with it, I guess, or maybe I'm not sure about that, but they're married, and he still has to give her a get, but he also has to do chalitza, because the get can never terminate the existing relationship. That's what the set of mishnayot in chapter 5 are about. So in other words, the rabbis actually added things to the standard yibum. The Mishnah says standard yibum is the Reuven sleeps with Shimon sleeps with Leah, and that's yibum. But the rabbis didn't like that, so they added something called ma'amar. Okay, so the mishnayot in chapter 5. I'm not going to get into the details of it here. If you saw the mishnayot, they give you the different possible cases. So the get is something that should not happen. But if you do give a get, man gives a get to the woman to remove her from this relationship between them, it doesn't work to accomplish anything, but it works to disqualify. That's what this set of mishnayot are about. And this chapter 5 is really the end, as it were, of the rules that apply to, strictly speaking, apply to this thing we call yibum. From chapter 6 on, it talks about yibum, but you get involved in all kinds of other very interesting questions. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is what the relationship is between some of these other rules and the idea of yibum. I wanted to mention one in particular, and before I look at another couple of mishnayot in chapter 6, and that's the following: what if you I don't know how far you've gotten in the Mishnah, but one of the topics that comes up in this Mishnah over and over that we will have to deal with in some detail is the idea comes up in the context of the woman eating truma. Now, let me just get to this truma thing. This is actually very important. So here's the point about truma. Truma is one of the gifts that people give to the Kohen. So when you have, say, crops, you take a part of you designate a part of your crop truma, and you give it to the Kohen. There are other gifts that you give to the Kohen, you give to the Levi, called Maaser, the tithe is given to the Levi. Truma is something that you give to the Kohen. Now, unlike Maaser, which means 1 out of 10, there is no amount that is stated about Truma. You can give a tenth of an ounce, and that's technically speaking sufficient. The Gemara says that you shouldn't do that, and the Gemara says that there are three different measurements for Truma. Either 1/40th of your crop, 1/50th, or 1/60th. That was the custom. There is no fixed amount. You can give whatever you want, but 1/60th would be the least. You shouldn't do less than that. And 1/50th is average, and 1/40th is more generous. The truma is not just a gift you give to the Kohen, but it also has a certain holy status. It's kodesh. The maaser to the Levi is actually not kodesh. The maaser is anybody can eat maaser. You give it to the Levi, but anybody can eat it. But the truma is kodesh. Now, that's a very important point. So now the question: you give it to the Kohen. Who is allowed to eat truma? This will be very relevant to a whole set of mishnayot in the tractate. So first of all, truma can be eaten by the Kohen. It can be eaten by his wife, and it can be eaten by his anything that he owns, that is slaves. They had slaves in those days, but those people are allowed to eat truma. The ones that he purchased, and then there's the wife, and it's himself. Okay. Now, let's say that there's a woman, she's not married, an unmarried woman. Her father is a Kohen. If the father's a Kohen, she is a Bat Kohen. She's the daughter of a Kohen. The father eats truma, and his family eats truma also, including his daughter. So as long as she's an unmarried woman, she will eat truma. Fine. Now let's say she marries a non-Kohen. When she marries the non-Kohen, she's living with this non-Kohen, she's not permitted to eat truma anymore. She's part of his family, and she can't eat truma. Fine. Now let's say this woman, Ms. Cohen, is married to a non-Kohen husband. He dies. What happens to her? She was a Kohen. She's the daughter of a Kohen. Can she eat truma or not? So the rule is like this. The rule is, if she has no children, she reverts back to her father's home, to the mishpacha, and she can eat truma. If she has children, however, then she may not eat truma. The Mishnah will deal with the following case. What happens if she's pregnant? The Mishnah likes the liminal cases, first of all. Now, the converse is also true. If there's a non-Kohen woman, right, and she can't eat truma. But if she marries a Kohen, she can eat truma. Now the husband dies. What's the rule? If they have no children, then she may not eat truma. But if she has a child, she's still considered connected to the deceased husband, and she may eat truma. Now, in my opinion, this I think is why this topic will come up in the tractate, and we'll deal with that probably next week. Because what's interesting about this case of the woman, either the Kohen woman married to the non-Kohen man, or the non-Kohen woman or married to the Kohen man, both sides. What's interesting is what you see in each of these two cases, which I think is one of the main themes of this tractate, is that even though death terminates the marriage, but what's interesting is that the Mishnah is understanding that is not necessarily fully the case. You see from Yibum itself, actually, that something exists after the guy's death, called Zika. Now, exactly what Zika is not clear. I mentioned last week the two ways to understand Zika. One is that the previous marriage still obtains. In some sense, in some limited sense, she's still married to the first guy. Or you could say differently, you could say not really married to the first guy, but since the second guy is supposed to marry her, she's in a certain sense already married to the second guy. Those are two different ways to see it. But the first possibility, which I think is very interesting, is that it says something about marriage, till death do us part, you know what I mean? But maybe not always the case, till death do us part. Maybe marriage can go beyond death, actually, in some cases. So I think that's actually a very interesting problem. And that, I think, is why these rules about truma come into play. And given the fact that that comes into play, then we have the cases that the Mishnah and the Talmud love, which is the case of the pregnant woman. So the pregnant woman, is she still connected to the guy or not? They know children. On the other hand, pregnant. So the Mishnah will deal with the question of the pregnant woman, to what extent she is connected. Okay, that's one point I wanted to make as an introduction to what we're going to have starting in chapter 6. Now, I wanted to make one other point about chapter 6, which is this. The end of chapter 6, Mishnah chapter 6, Mishnah number 6. Chapter 6, Mishnah 6. Actually, let's start chapter 6, Mishnah 5. Let's start with chapter 6, Mishnah 5. We'll go back next week and touch upon these other mishnayot before that. But I'm going to look at two mishnayot now, get about 15 minutes or so. The Mishnah says this. According to the Mishnah, Kohen hedyot lo yisa ayomit. Elohim ken yesh lo isha uvanim. So the Mishnah says, an ayonit is a woman who cannot have children. Let's leave it at that for now. She's not going to have children. So the Mishnah says, the Mishnah was talking about the Kohen, whom a Kohen is allowed to marry, whom a Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry. The Torah has all kinds of restrictions. But leave it out for now. But then the Mishnah says, Kohen hedyot lo yisa ayonit, Elohim ken yesh lo isha ubanim. According to the Tanakama, so the Kohen hedyot should not marry the ayonit. She can't have children, except if he already has children. If he has children, he's permitted. Now, it's not just the Kohen hedyot, but since the context was Kohen hedyot, and because of the next opinion, it talked about a Kohen hedyot. In other words, according to the first view, one of the purposes of marriage is to have children. That is what the Mishnah is suggesting. Rabbi Yehuda says, Afa pisha yeshlo isha ubanim, or yisa ayunit, shehi zona ha'amura batorah. V'chachamim omrim ein zona, el giyoret u'meshuchreret, v'shenivala bi'latznud. So in this Mishnah, in Tractate Yevamot, which was talking about the Kohen, the different Kohanim whom they can marry, suddenly we have a very interesting Mishnah over here. It's the end of this, the Mishnah number 5 and 6, which are the final two mishnayot of chapter number 6. And according to the first view, here it says Kohen, it means anybody. A man shouldn't marry a woman who cannot have children. That's what the Mishnah says. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, Kohen shouldn't marry, even if he has children, because the Iwanet, he says, is Zona Hamura Batorah. Now, the Torah says that a Kohen is not allowed to marry certain women. A divorcee, one of them is the Zona. Zona, Chalal, Gusha, Zona, and Chalala are not allowed to marry. Once again, you wonder why this is in Tractate Yevamot. You would expect it to be in Tractate Kedushin or something like that. But leave that aside for now. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, this comes under the category of a Zona. A Zona means literally a prostitute. This woman is not a prostitute. She can be the holiest woman in the world. But the fact is, that's Rabbi Yehuda's definition. Fine. The Chachamim disagree with him. She's not a Zona. A Zona is a convert, a woman that converted, or a slave that was freed, or someone who had illicit relationships. Nivala bilat znut. Now, the convert and the freed slave woman, the reason for that presumably is that the Mishnah assumes that she had some kind of illicit relationship before she marries the Kohen. Nivala bilat znut, a woman that had a relationship with somebody that with a forbidden relationship, which disqualifies her from marrying a Kohen. We have to remember that when it comes to the Kohen, basically, this is not the main point I want to get to, but with the Kohen, this is a big issue, by the way. In other words, you have these rules, which are in the Mishnah. And some of these rules, I would say, I'll speak personally, but I think it's probably applies to most people nowadays. Some of these rules are rules that strike us as not really relating to our situation. For example, a Kohen is not allowed to marry a Zona. A Zona, we think of a Zona as a prostitute. But in point of fact, though, the Mishnah elsewhere makes the point that if, let's say there's a married couple, let's say a normal, not a Kohen, a married couple, the woman is actually raped by somebody. She's raped by somebody. So in terms of the relationship with her husband, they of course remain married. Oh, it's horrific, but they remain married. They're married, period. But when it comes to a Kohen whose wife was raped, depending who did it, let's say a non-Jew or something, bilat znut, then actually he's not allowed to live with her anymore on the books, that is to say. You can understand that this would be a very problematic law for 25 different reasons. But that's what this Mishnah is talking about. The definition of Zona in the Mishnah applies even where the woman is completely blameless. She's a victim. But the Kohen, only the Kohen, because of the kahuna, is not permitted to stay married to her. That's what the second half of the Mishnah is talking about. The Zona, who is the Zona? Or someone who was not a non-Jewish woman that converts. Is technically speaking, she's a Zona, technically speaking. And therefore the Kohen is not permitted to marry her. That's what's on the books in any event. And these are some of the questions that come up in today's world all the time. But that's not why this Mishnah is primarily here. The point of the Mishnah is the first part, that according to the first opinion, one of the purposes, if not the main purpose of marriage, is to have children. Now this fits in very nicely with Tractate Yevamot, because the whole point of Yibum, the Torah says it straight up. The man died without children. So the wife, if there's a brother, the brother marries the wife in order to maintain the lines of the deceased brother. Somehow the child that is born, in the words of the Torah, will be called after the brother. So that's what Yibum is about. And once Yibum is about that, the Mishnah then goes on in the next Mishnah to discuss why it's so important to have children in the first place, or or put it differently, is there a mitzvah to have children? So that's the next Mishnah. That's how it gets involved in Tractate Yevamot. It's pretty basic question. And the next Mishnah makes it clear. This is chapter 6, Mishnah number 6. Well, yibatel adam b'pirya v'rivya. So the Mishnah says that a person should not withhold oneself. It's only for the man over here. We'll see. Elohim kain yesh lo banim. Except if he has children. If let's talk about the man now. If a man has children, then he doesn't have to have more children. We don't know how. But how many he has children? What does banim mean? What is children? Beit Shammai omrim shnei secharim. Beit Shammai says 2 sons. If he has 2 sons, he fulfilled the commandment of having children. Pru revu, first mitzvah of the Torah, right? And Beit Hillel omrim zachar u'nekeva. Shenemar zachar u'nekeva Abraham. Beit Hillel, whom we follow, says no, it means a boy and a girl. In order, the fulfillment of having children is having a boy and a girl. Zachar u'nekeva Abraham. Fine. That's the first. So there you see, for the first time we encounter in the Mishnah, there is such a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah. Again, this is a legal, in a certain sense, a legal document. But once you have the children, okay, once you fulfilled your mitzvah, then you're okay. That's what the Mishnah seems to say. Fine. Then the Mishnah continues. Nasa isha v'shaha ima eser shanim v'lo yolda enu rashai libatel. If a man married a woman and they were together for 10 years and they have no children, he's not permitted to libatel, to cease from trying to have children. That is to say, in the Mishnah, he can marry another woman, takes another wife, okay? But the fact is, or he finds another wife, an additional wife or whatever. But 10 years, of course, is based on the pasuk in the Chumash about Abraham and Sarah. They were living 10 years in the land, and Sarah goes to Abraham and says, I can't have children, take my servant Hagar. Fine. Gersha, muteret lina se liyacher. So if he divorced her, she's permitted to marry somebody else. V'rashai hasheni v'shot ima eser shanim, and the second husband can stay with her for 10 years. Bibi pila, if she miscarried, mona misha shei pila, then the 10 years count from the miscarriage. Fine. That's the first part of the Mishnah. The presumption here, it seems to be that if they can't have children, that she's the one responsible for it, which is hardly the case. But in any event, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It doesn't matter. That's what the Mishnah says. But you see, there's such a mitzvah exists, and this is playing out of Yibum. Fine. That's the first half of the Mishnah. The next part of the Mishnah is, the man has a mitzvah, has an obligation to have children. The woman has no obligation. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka disagrees. Al Shneim hu Omer, vayivarach otam Elohim, vayomer lahem Elohim pru urevu. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says no. The pasuk says God said to them, plural, blessed them, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. So the Mishnah has a machloket about whose mitzvah it is. Is it a mitzvah on the man, or it's a mitzvah on the man and the woman? That's a disagreement. And the first part of the Mishnah talks about the circumstances under which, to what degree you have to make sure, the man has to make sure in the Mishnah, that he can have children. If his wife can't have children, then he has to have it after 10 years. Again, if she miscarried, you count the 10 years from then, she can remarry. Maybe she can't have children with this guy, so she can remarry, etc. So this is actually, again, related to the idea of Yibum, because the whole idea of Yibum is that they should, line should somehow continue. The Gemara, now again, this is the Mishnah. I said many times, the Mishnah is the gateway to Torah Sheba'al Peh. So you have the Gemara, you have all kinds of discussion of the Gemara, etc. And the rule is stated in the Mishnah. The Gemara often will qualify. Let's put it that way. Will qualify. Sometimes there's a different source that overrides the Mishnah, but this is where the topics are raised. The idea of a couple that's married for 10 years that the man has some kind of obligation. Nowadays, a man can't take a second wife nowadays after a man Gershom. So to divorce his wife, that may be the rule on the books, but one understands very well that for any number of reasons, that often is not the case. That there are childless couples who live together for years, and they feel committed to each other. Don't have to explain that. So again, these are all kinds of exceptions to the rule. But anyway, but the point of the Mishnah is clear. The point is the Mishnah thinks that there is some kind of obligation to have children, and the Gemara actually takes it beyond. Just wanted to mention that the Gemara, what typically does, the Gemara suggests that in fact there's another mitzvah. In other words, the Mishnah here, often the Mishnah does not give its sources. Most mishnayot don't give you the biblical sources. In this particular case, this Mishnah, which is unusual, mentions two different psukim from the beginning of the Torah. One is Zachar u'nekeva bra'am. That's the source of Beit Hillel, that the obligation of having children means at least one boy and one girl. And the second pasuk, which is the end of this Mishnah and the end of the chapter, that God said to them, Pru urevu. So there's a dispute whether the woman is obligated to have children or not. What the Gemara, though, says is actually very interesting. The Gemara quotes another pasuk. Lo tohu b'ra'ah, lo shevet yitzara. God did not create the world to be tohu, to be empty or chaotic, or to be devoid of people. Lo shevet yitzara. It's a verse in Yeshayahu. The earth is here for people to live in. So the Gemara says that apart from the mitzvah that's from the Torah, Pru Revu from the Chumash, but there's also another mitzvah not from the Torah, but from the prophetic writings, which has a lower status, but nonetheless, and that what they call shevet, that's equally the obligation falls equally upon men and women. So the Gemara already is making a different point, which is there's the technical obligation from the Torah, who has to take the initiative, and then there's the other obligation to populate the world, which falls on men and women both. So what's interesting about this, and I'll just stop and take comments. We're running out of time here, unfortunately. I think we ran out of time. It doesn't matter. I'll take a couple of comments. Again, one of the things we think about is what are these mishnayot doing in this tractate? And here it's pretty clear. And next week we'll start with chapter 7, and we'll go through several very interesting mishnayot. Let me stop here. Take any comments or questions. All right, if there are no questions, that's fine. We will continue next week. We will meet next week at 1:00. And again, we're moving right through the Masechet. Next week, I'll pick out mishnayot from chapters 7 and 8. And if anybody has any questions, my email is dsilber@drisha.org. If anybody has any questions, you can just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to respond. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber.
Thank you. Thank you.
As Rabbi Silber mentioned, this class will be meeting on Sunday, next Sunday, but a few housekeeping notes. Rabbi Helfgott's class Between Heaven and Earth will not be meeting this Monday, November 20th, and nor will Drisha's Thursday classes be meeting in observance of Thanksgiving. 2 new classes are beginning after Thanksgiving: Hanukkah, Holiday of Home Buddies, Tuesdays starting November 8th at 8 p.m. with Rabbi Leah Sana, and Technologies of Transmission on Wednesdays at 8 p.m. with Rabbi Sarah Wolkenfeld, beginning Wednesday, November 29th. Our Winter Zman classes are up at 5784.drisha.org/winter, which I will post in chat. And with that, I hope that everyone has a good day.